Well, welcome to those of you on Zoom and those of you here in person to week 5 of 6 of our Genesis class. We got since we're coming up against a hard deadline next week, we have a lot to kind of get through. I'm gonna hit just a couple minutes of review here of what we talked about last week and kind of lead us into our continued conversation from last week into this week. And then we're going to hit a number of the kind of major stories over the next 10, 12 chapters or something of Genesis, and give kind of a just oversight or overview for the other chapters, but really spend some time talking about kind of some of the main stories about the main characters, especially some of the stories that have traditionally been a little odd or confusing. So we want to kind of cover those and take a look at them. Tonight is going to focus, so we're going to start with just our conversation from last week. We kind of stopped in the middle of it, which is the binding of Isaac story in Genesis chapter 22. But most of tonight's going to focus on what you see in the first slide here, Isaac and Rebekah and their sons Jacob and Esau. Then of course Jacob's family, his wives, his sons, his daughter. So that's kind of where our focus is going to be tonight. Last week we talked about circumcision as being part of the covenant that God came to Abraham and said this is going to be a sign of the covenant, this act of circumcision. Then we talked about the story of Abraham pleading for the city of and people of Sodom and Gomorrah. Just as a reminder, you know, he comes, this is, let's see. Then Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? And then, of course, he proceeds, you know, what if there's 45? What if there's 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10 righteous people? Will you spare the city? And each time God says yes, but it's important to remember that argument back and forth, that negotiation, as we touched on it last week, but we'll talk a little bit more about it tonight when talking about the binding of Isaac's story, and that God kind of challenging, or Abraham challenging God there on behalf of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. After Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed, we had the odd story of Lot and his daughters. Essentially, they tricked him by getting him drunk. They tricked him into sleeping with them, and they had children, they had sons based on that interaction. And I mentioned it last week, and I want to remind you tonight, because it's going to come up again a couple times, that remember that for the author of Genesis, there was no judgment there on the daughters, that what they did was wrong or what they did was right. I mean, if anything, for the author of Genesis makes it seem like it's a good thing, because remember, from one of those sons, Moab, comes Ruth. Ruth marries Boaz. Their grandson is King David. And of course, as Christians, we also see Jesus coming from that same line. So for the author of Genesis, not only is their deception of their father not condemned, but it seems like, hey, it happened, here, it turned out good. I don't think we can go as far as saying the author of Genesis says this was a good thing that they did, but he certainly doesn't condemn their deception, their trickery there. I mean, if anything, it really pictures them as, you know, finding favor within God's judgment, that later on in the rest of the Hebrew Bible, they're spoken of, those people that came from Lot's daughters are spoken of sometimes rather well. So it almost is like a fulfillment of the promise that other nations will be blessed because of Abraham and Abraham's family. So we have that picture from the author of Genesis. Remember, throughout Genesis, our author is showing us the separation that happens between humans and God and humans with each other, and then how God can create something from nothing and turn nobodies into somebodies. And that focus for the promise to Abraham of blessing the entire world through him and his family seems to be fulfilled somewhat in the actions of Lot's daughters. And we have the story, or the mentioning of Isaac being born, this picture that portrays certainly Abraham as a 100-year-old and Sarah as a 90-year-old here at the birth of Isaac. We have the story of Ishmael. It said Ishmael was mocking Isaac. We don't know exactly what that means. I mentioned last week that in Jewish tradition, the mocking is what Ishmael was telling Isaac was, I was circumcised when I was 13. In other words, I had a choice in the matter. I chose to follow God. I chose to be in covenant with God. You were circumcised at 8 days old, and you had no choice in the matter. So essentially saying, I'm better for that. This upsets Sarah, of course, and she tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away, and they are indeed sent out into the desert. Where the promise to Hagar is reiterated that God will turn Ishmael into a great nation, just like he is going to turn Isaac's family into a great nation and continue the promise to Abraham through Isaac. But because Ishmael is also Abraham's son, that he will partake in a different way, but still taking part in the promise of a future family and generations to come. Are there any questions or comments just on that short little review before we get back into our story? So again, this is that one painting. I think we'll come back to it, but I always find this painting in particular just a little bit haunting. Obviously, the face of Isaac, I think, is what stands out in this, in this painting. In Genesis chapter 22, once again, I don't know if you have Genesis 22 open, what does the title say? Does it say something like the sacrifice of Isaac, the binding of Isaac, Abraham tested? Who's got it out? Anyone want to share what they see in their Bible, their translation? Abraham tested. I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the translations have moved towards putting that as the title. It used to be for a long time that it was called the sacrifice of Isaac, and in general, you'll still hear the story referred to that way, the sacrifice of Isaac. In Jewish tradition, in Jewish teaching, they call it the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Because in the end, Isaac was not actually sacrificed. So they say, we're not going to call it the sacrifice of Isaac because he wasn't sacrificed, but he was bound. So they call it the binding of Isaac. But it's interesting, the idea of Abraham being tested, and certainly in the, right at the start, it tells us God set out to test Abraham. But in Jewish tradition, there's three ideas of who's being tested. One, of course, is Abraham. And part of that tradition is that Abraham did not offer a sacrifice at the feast that he threw. When Isaac was weaned and Abraham threw the feast, he didn't offer a sacrifice at that feast. And so he felt bad about it later, and basically God said, okay, now here's your chance, and tells him to sacrifice Isaac. And that's where the test of Abraham comes from. There's also a lesser kind of tradition of testing the angels. It really just follows the storyline of Job, kind of the accuser. The angels come and say, Abraham's not as good as you think he is, and God says, well, go ahead and test him, and he'll show you. But the other more interesting one is the test of Isaac. I mentioned that in Jewish tradition, the mocking of Ishmael to Isaac is that he says, I was circumcised at 13 years old, you were only 8 days old, you didn't have a choice. And in Jewish tradition, Isaac responds by saying, if I could, I'd give my whole body to God. And the resulting story is like God saying, prove it. And as we mentioned last week, we often, in artwork throughout the ages, and I think in our own minds, often just think of Isaac as a small child. We see that he carries the wood, that he talks, so he's not like an infant. But we often picture him as kind of this helpless, confused, doesn't know what's going on child in this story. But really, he was anywhere from like 17 to 37. So he certainly would have known what was going on. So it certainly can be seen as a test of Isaac in the sense that if Isaac knows what's about to happen to him and he's willing to go along with it. I mean, remember that at this point, Abraham is at least 117 years old or something like that. And if Isaac is a 17-year-old, 27-year-old, 37-year-old, he could easily overpower Abraham and say, I'm not going to let you bind me and put me on this altar. So Isaac could have easily stopped it. So there is some aspect to the story of Isaac's willingness to go along with the sacrifice there. We read through the story real quick last week. Here's another picture from that Awkward Moments children's Bible. The big smile on Abraham's face there, like over on the side, just again kind of portrays the scene in a ridiculous way to really get us to wrestle with the scripture itself. And then you probably can't read it, so I'll read it here. It says, dangerous obedience. Abraham hears God's voice telling him to kill his only son. Without a single question, Abraham agrees to kill Isaac. As a reward for his obedience, God blesses Abraham and his family for many generations. The end. So that's what I want to pick up from tonight is to get back into the story. We're going to go, we read through it quickly last week just to get the sense of the story and kind of how fast it does go and how abrupt some of it seems. And a lot of you had great observations and questions that we're going to kind of come back to tonight. But again, if you have questions or comments, feel free to put your hand up on Zoom, type it in the chat, and Rob will relay it. Helen, I think, has the mic, right? Yeah. So she'll bring it to you if you don't want to get up, but please use the mic so everyone can hear you online and in person. If you're really against that, once again, just keep the answer short and sweet, and so I can repeat it back for everybody. So this is Genesis chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. So one of the things that we notice right away is he says, go forth to a place I will show you. Just like he told Abraham at the beginning of chapter 12, go forth to a place that I will show you. It's interesting here that, in Genesis chapter 12, when God says, go forth to a place that I will show you, he calls him out of his native land, away from his native gods and goddesses, to follow him into a land that he hasn't even told Abraham where it is yet, but just says, trust me, and I'll take you there. He's asking him to sacrifice his past. You got to leave all that stuff behind and come and follow me. So in this story, when he says, go forth to a place I will show you, right at the beginning of the story in Genesis chapter 22, what's he going to ask of Abraham but to sacrifice his future? And that is Isaac. And I added all these ands here because in the Hebrew, this is how it reads. Hebrew writers really like run-on sentences. That's a no-no in English, but they like them and they always mean something. So I'm going to read it. This is the NIV version, but with the ands added in. So I'm going to read it that way. And again, notice just the abrupt movement. Like the Awkward Moments Children's Bible says, without a single question, Abraham, went and did this. And we talked about it last week. Some of you had that observation. There's no fight from Abraham. There's no talk back. There's no challenge. There's no negotiation like there was with Sodom and Gomorrah, where he's like, you're not this kind of God. Far be it from you to do this. And there's none of that here. It's just, hey, Abraham, I told you about all this stuff that I promised you for your future, the stars in the sky, the sand on the seashores. That's all going to happen through Isaac, but I want you to go kill Isaac. And he literally says, I want you to go incinerate your son. And it's like, with that question, just like, well, Abraham gets up early the next morning and it starts to go. And early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey, and he took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. And when he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place God had told him about, and on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance, and he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there, and we will worship, and we will come back to you. So the sentence from the Hebrew writer's point of view is there's movement there. And again, it's just this odd picture of why is Abraham moving so quickly, or so successfully? Like we would expect him to lollygag or like to delay it, and to take his time. If he's really resigned to the fact that this needs to happen, or resigned to the fact that he at least needs to go through with these initial actions, you would expect him to, have a slower process. But from the author's point of view, it's movement, and he's doing this, and he goes this, and and this is next, and this is next, and this is next. And then again, this idea, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there, and we will worship, and we will come back to you. We're going to come back to this idea, but it's a little curious that he tells the servants, we'll come back to you, meaning he and Isaac. But let's continue the story. First, Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the two of them went on together. So a couple of things there. Isaac seems talkative, inquisitive. He's asking questions. He's noticing what's going on around him, which is going to be in stark contrast to what comes next. So, he's asking, I understand that we're supposed to be going along to do this sacrifice, but where's the sacrifice? Where's the rest of what we need here? I mentioned that mini-series that was on TV called The Bible, and there's an interesting scene in this story. When they portray this story, they show Sarah back at the camp, back at their house, back among the tents, and she apparently knows that they went to offer a sacrifice, but all of a sudden she notices that all the animals are still there. And she starts frantically asking everybody, why didn't they take the lamb? Why didn't they take the lamb? And she's kind of starts freaking out because she realizes, as in her mind, that, Abraham didn't take something along the sacrifice, and starts to worry about what that might mean for Isaac. It's really, obviously that's not a scene that happens in this story in the Bible, but it's an interesting way to portray kind of the background on what's going on with the rest of the family. Because as we talked, some of you noticed last week, where's Sarah in this entire story? She's totally absent in this story. We hear nothing about what she thinks of what's happening. We don't know what Abraham told her. We don't know if she knows. We don't know if she's been lied to. We don't know anything about what Sarah is thinking or feeling at this point. She's not in the story. I want to point out here, too, some just repetition of words and phrases. I put them highlighted in different colors there. They may not look real different to you up there, but so sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. And then we get another "here I am." Now, in the NIV, the one I read from, it says, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Abraham, father." And the NIV just says, "Yes, my son." But in the Hebrew, it says, "Here I am, my son." So it's the same phrase. When God first calls to Abraham, and he says, "Here I am." When Isaac says, "Father," he says, "Here I am, my son." And then, of course, the phrase there also, "my son." Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And I always wonder about the repetition there of "my son," because it's a little unnatural. Now, if you're from like a Hispanic culture, like a Mexican family, you might, somebody says "mijo" or "mija," like my son, my daughter, my boy, my girl. But in most cultures, it's a little, it comes across as awkward. He says, Isaac says, "Hey, Dad," and he says, "Yes, my son." It's a very strange, portrayal of what's happening. And then even stranger, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. But that repetition there, you kind of wonder, why is Abraham saying that? Why is he saying "my son"? Whose benefit is that for? You can see how it could be for Isaac's benefit. Abraham keeps calling him "my son" as just a reassurance to him, everything is going to be okay. I don't know what's going to happen up here, but God is in control. You're my son. I care for you. I love you. I'm trying to obey God, but he's, saying my son just almost as like a reassurance to Isaac, basically. Or maybe it's just his own emotion coming through. Like, he thinks he's going up here. He's supposed to sacrifice his entire future, his son Isaac, and he's just in his own mind just keeps saying, my son, my son, my son. This is my son that I'm taking up there to do this to. And remember that God had said to him, your son, your only son, Isaac. Probably a reminder, of course, that's not his only son. He had Ishmael first. But it's probably a reminder to God right up front to, remember Abraham before has said, why don't you just do the blessing through Ishmael, not worry about another son with Sarah. Just you do the blessing through Ishmael. Everything will be fine. And God says that's not what's going to happen. That's not going to be what's going to happen. And it's almost like God right up front saying, before you even ask, like, don't bring up Ishmael. I already told you it's going through Isaac. He's your only son when it comes to the promise. And in that regard, maybe Abraham's trying to just remind God who this is. He just keeps saying, my son, like, kind of, you listening to this, God? Like, this is my son. Remember Isaac? My entire future, the one you had promised for so many years, the one that you had reiterated the promise over and over again to me, the stars in the sky, the sand on the seashore, all coming from Isaac, my son, my only son. This is the one that you're saying I'm supposed to keep walking up this hill and incinerate. So we don't know exactly why he keeps saying my son there, but you can kind of see from that just, the different reasons that he might be saying it, because the writing itself is just a little unnatural in that regard. Yeah. Yeah, Alan's got it.
Can you go back to the slide, the previous slide? Yeah, so also what jumps out at me, I know you've highlighted the things there, but what jumps out at me is when the angel of the Lord called on him from heaven, he says, Abraham, Abraham. Now, I don't know what the time frame is and how long Abraham has been Abraham. He was Abram, right?
Yeah.
And now he's Abraham. And so the angel's like, father of many multitude of nations, father of multitude of nations, at this time when that multitude of nations is going to be slaughtered, or like you said, burnt to a crisp kind of thing. So I think, I don't know, there's a lot of irony or stuff mixed messages going on here, right?
Yeah, that's a good pickup. And certainly the author would love that as a Hebrew writer. What Bob's referring to is that, remember, Abram means like exalted father, but Abraham, the name that God changes Abram's name to, Abraham, means father of multitudes, father of many, something like that. So it's almost this ironic thing at the beginning to say Abraham. It's like, hey, father of multitudes, but not for long. Because this is what I'm going to ask you to do. So, yeah, it's a great observation. And yeah. Any other question or comment? Well, verse 9, then, when they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. We have some of these pictures here from last week. This one, it's interesting, this one with his hand covering Isaac's face. In the Quran, which is the Muslim holy book, they have the same story. Now, in their tradition, it's Ishmael that is in this story, not Isaac. In the Quran, it doesn't actually say one way or the other. It just says Abraham's son. But in Muslim tradition, it's usually thought that that's Ishmael. But there's a point in the story in the Quran where the son of Abraham, who's going to be sacrificed, says, like, turn me over and put my forehead to the ground, because if you look at my face, you're not going to go through with it. And you need to go through with it. And so some artists portray, in a similar regard, I don't think they're taking it necessarily from the Quran, but, covering Isaac's face, or in that first painting that we looked at, kind of having him turned over with his forehead to the ground so he can't see his face. You can kind of understand from Abraham's perspective of not wanting to look his son in the face if he's going to go through with this. What's that? Oh, the angel, had to get Abraham's attention. It looks like he's going to slap him. This one portrays Isaac kind of like, looks like a middle teenager. This one, he looks much older, probably around more like 30, 37-year-old, like some people think. Oh, here's that other painting of his face kind of to the ground there. But again, it's a good reminder of there must be some aspect of the story here of Isaac's acceptance and willingness to go along with this. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. There's the third, here I am. Remember, in the beginning of the story, God says, Abraham, Abraham. He says, here I am. Isaac says, Father. He says, here I am, my son. And now this last, here I am. I always think it's funny, if you think about the here I ams in this story, just how different they must have sounded if you were there in person, or if somebody was, had a video camera and could record it, and you were watching it. Like, what would these here I ams sound like? The first one to me, like, Abraham's like minding his own business, and God just calls out to him, Abraham. And he just says, oh, here I am, God. It always reminds me, like, for those of you who know Jim Price, if you ever just called out to him from across the room, like, hey, Jim, he'd always say, yo, yo. And it was always, especially upstairs in the offices, like if you called out over the, dividers into his office, hey, Jim, he'd go, yo. That's what this always strikes me here, is like when God first says to Abraham, hey, Abraham, he's like, yo, I'm right here, God. Like, what do you need? And, the second one, certainly when Isaac says dad or father, and he says, here I am, my son, how different that's not a Jim Price yo kind of here I am. That's almost like, again, like a reminder to himself, to God, to Isaac, I'm right here. I'm your father. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm trying to obey God, but I love you. You're my future. I'm here with you. We're going through this together. Here I am. The third one in this last instance, when the picture, of course, is that Abraham, has the knife above his head and is about to kill Isaac, that when he's called out to Abraham, Abraham, I just picture like a relief. Yes, I'm here. Here I am. Like, what do you need? Like, or I knew it. I knew you were going to stop me. Like, and we don't know what Abraham thought. Like, did Abraham assume God was going to stop him all along? Did he think he was going to have to go through with it? Either way, there must have been such a sense of relief when he's called out to, right at the last moment there. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide, and to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. It's interesting, that word there for provide, it can be provide, but it can also, it's the same root for seen. So it could be the Lord will see, or the Lord has seen, which is an interesting kind of connection with Hagar. You are the God who sees me. That now what Hagar proclaimed about God, Abraham is now confirming here, that you're the God who sees, you're the God who provides in this instance here. I always think this sculpture is interesting because it's probably a little hard for you to tell on that, but if you look at the one I sent you, if you can see on this screen up here, you don't know where the story is at in this sculpture. Like, is this before? Is this right after the binding, but before the act of sacrifice and before Abraham is stopped? And what is Isaac doing? Is he begging for Abraham not to go through with this? Or is this right after what we just read? After it's been stopped, and is Isaac now off the wood of sacrifice there? And now what's he saying to Abraham? I can't believe you were about to do that. Or, hey, Dad, I know that was hard for you. It was hard for me, but God is providing. I just always think this sculpture is interesting because, again, you don't know what point in the story this is taking place from the artist's point of view here. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time, and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. So one thing is the angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time. Why the distinction for the author there? Why does he just showed us that the angel called out to Abraham. Why right after that did he say, and he called out a second time? We all know it's the second time. Why does the author tell us the second time? It's to distinguish the promise from what just happened. The promise is not based on Abraham's obedience. It's not like God made the covenant with Abraham. God doesn't go back on that. Even if Abraham had disobeyed in this instance, the promise is still in place because it's a promise from God. And God doesn't go back on the covenantal promises. So the author is separating those two because now he's reiterating the promise again to Abraham. But again, it wasn't because, and the English is a little awkward there. It says that because you have done this, and makes it sound like it was dependent on his obedience. That God's saying, okay, now I know you're really the person that I want to continue these covenantal promises with. That's not what God is saying here. It's kind of, the Hebrew is more like, because these things have occurred, or because these things have happened, and reiterates the promise to him just to remind him of the promise. Like, hey, I asked you to sacrifice your past, when I brought you to this land, and now I ask you to sacrifice your future with your son. But, obviously he's been stopped at this point, but then God still reminds Abraham here in this instance just what his covenantal promises to him are. Yeah, Bob?
I don't think I need the mic. I want you to just remind us where this is taking place. I think we covered it last week, but Moriah, the region of Moriah, where is that?
Yeah, the question is, where's the region of Moriah that this is taking place? They go up from the Negev, from the desert area. Now, traditionally, Moriah has been combined or associated with Moreh. So you have Moriah, M-O-R-I-A-H, Moriah, and then you have Mount Moreh, M-O-R-E-H in our English spelling. Now, Mount Moreh is where the Temple Mount is. If you've been to modern day Jerusalem or see a picture of Jerusalem, it's always of the golden dome of the rock that's built over the rock that Jewish people and Christians believe is the rock that Abraham brought Isaac to for this sacrifice. And so we don't know for sure that those two places are supposed to be associated with each other. So we don't actually know. I mean, if you follow that tradition, you know exactly where it happened. But if you don't, then it could be anywhere kind of in this region. We just know they go up to a high place. Which would certainly mean in the region of where Jerusalem is, because that's up in the hill country in the mountains of Israel. So yeah, that's the region that's happening here. But yeah, interestingly, then you have at the end, then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. Well, who's missing? Isaac's missing, and it's like, where'd he go? What happened to Isaac in this? It just says Abraham comes back to his servants, and they set off for Beersheba, and Abraham stayed there. But it doesn't ever tell us where Isaac went. In some Jewish tradition, they think that Abraham sent Isaac back to Sarah, knowing that if he went back and faced Sarah himself, Sarah would never let him be around Isaac again. And so Abraham just sends Isaac back to his mother and basically says, I'll talk to you later. I'll be in touch. I'll give you a call. And it sends him back to Sarah, which of course brings up another question, just again about Sarah and where she's been in this entire story, and what the result is, which we'll come back to in a minute. I do want to just say, there's always the question about, did Abraham pass the test? It says God tested Abraham, but it doesn't say what the test is. We always assume it's is it obedience that he's going to go through? But certainly there's thinking that really what he was supposed to do was fight with God like he fought with God over Sodom and Gomorrah. Because what Abraham did was he was a very good pagan. He was willing to offer a child sacrifice, just like all the pagans in the surrounding area were willing to do. But what he was supposed to do in this thinking is say to God, no, that's not the kind of God you are. Just like he said to God over Sodom and Gomorrah, that's not the kind of God you are. Far be it from you to do that. That you're supposed to say, I know you brought me into this land to be different than all these people. I know that you are a different God than all the other gods and goddesses of all these surrounding people groups. That's not the kind of God that I know you to be. And he was supposed to kind of fight God on that. So we don't know, again, Abraham seems to, there seems to be some judgment on Abraham about what he did by sending Hagar and Ishmael away, and this whole thing is a result of that he failed to show compassion for Ishmael, his son, and so it's like God is failing to show compassion for Abraham's other son, Isaac, and part of the test of Abraham was to see if he goes through with it. But there's also some aspect of the story that seems like Abraham might be testing God. What if Abraham never thought that God was really going to go through with it? What if he didn't fight with God like we think maybe he should have? He fought with God over these terribly wicked and unrighteous people in Sodom and Gomorrah. He fought for them, but why not for Isaac? But maybe this is Abraham's test of God. I know you're not the kind of God that does this kind of thing. I know that's not who you are. So I'm not sure what you're up to, God, but I'm going to go through the motions, and all those ands that we read. And he does this, and he gets prepared, and he loads all this up, and he finally gets there, and he goes up. And it's like God and Abraham are almost like in a game of chicken, or a staring contest. And in this instance, it's God who blinks. God stops him and says, you're right, that's not the kind of God that I am. And so Abraham, in that sense, certainly we would say that he passed the test there. Later in Jeremiah, God explicitly says, it would never even dawn on me to ask for human sacrifice. So if that's the kind of God that we see in our scriptures under the prophet Jeremiah, we would certainly assume that's who God is in this story as well, that God's not the kind of God that would demand human sacrifice. So Abraham seems to make a decision, I guess, between obeying God or acting ethically. Like the ethical, moral choice was to not go through with human sacrifice. But of course, the obedience to God, that God is telling him to do that there seems to be some kind of choice between those two things. And he certainly chose. Now, that sounds funny in our mind, of course, you can't, obedience to God would automatically mean, making a moral or ethical choice or, that kind of faith. But I think we can admire Abraham's faith while still thinking that he made a bad moral choice. The ethical and moral choice would be for him to say, no way I'm going to go through with child sacrifice, but the obedience to God is the other aspect of that. Think about, there's a movie, what was it? Them That Follow. It came out a few years ago. It takes place in the United States, Appalachia. In the southern United States and in Appalachia, there's still, this isn't a very popular Christian community that does this, but if you've ever heard of snake handling, it still exists in some Christian communities in the South and in Appalachia, and that's where this movie is set. And in the movie, Christian communities that practice snake handling with poisonous, venomous snakes, the idea is taken from the book of Mark, where it says, they'll be, by their faith, they'll be able to handle these kind of serpents or snakes and not be bitten. And so Christian communities use it to prove their faith. They handle snakes to show that they have faith in God, that they're not going to be bitten. And in this movie, of course, there's a teenage son who is very skeptical of all this, but his dad and the pastor make him handle snakes, and of course he's bitten. Spoiler alert. Of course he's bitten, and he's very, very sick, and he's going to die. And some people in the community are saying, we have to get this kid out of here to a hospital. And the parents and the pastor are saying, no, we have to have faith in God and rely on God to heal him and not take him to a doctor. So in that instance, you see, you can admire their faith while still thinking they're making a bad ethical or moral choice. And I think similarly, we would almost have to say that about Abraham, that he made a choice, and that this choice was to obey God, even though that seems to be a bad ethical or moral choice, which in the end, of course, we know, and the author kind of clues us in from the beginning that this is a test of Abraham, just so we know that the God that is acting in this story is the same God from the prophet Jeremiah. It would never dawn on God to require human sacrifice here. Are there any questions or comments on any of that? I do want to point out a few things. Ab sent me some of these last week after our time together and talking, so I appreciate his feedback. These are just some similarities in the story between Isaac and the story of Jesus. Of course, they're the only begotten son, Isaac so-called, and certainly Jesus is the only begotten son. They both result from a miraculous pregnancy. There's a donkey in the story. Isaac carries wood for the sacrifice. Jesus carries the wooden cross. They are both bound. There's an aspect of the third day when Abraham and Isaac journey. It's on the third day that this takes place, and of course the third day aspect in the story of Jesus. For Isaac and Jesus both, there's a willingness to be sacrificed. There's an animal caught in thorns in the story with Isaac, and there's the crown of thorns with the story of Jesus. And then this line from the story of Isaac, the Lord will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Now that sounds a little funny in English, but I purposefully put it this way because that's how it is in the Hebrew. So I'll say it again. The Lord will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So you can see how Christians can look at that phrasing of how it is in the Hebrew and take that to the story of Christ. The Lord will provide himself. The Lord will provide himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Now, certainly, remember in the beginning, or in the story with Isaac, he asked Abraham, but where is the lamb to be sacrificed? And this is Abraham's response. And then what do we see sacrificed at the end of the Isaac story? I hate trick questions, but it's kind of a trick question. I never try and trip you up when I ask you. A ram is sacrificed. Now, for Christians, what that means for us is the sacrificial lamb is still to come. Because Isaac asked, but where's the lamb that's going to be sacrificed? And they end up sacrificing a ram, which means that the sacrificial lamb is still to come, and that's Jesus. Any questions just about that? I want to close this part of the story out by talking about the death of Sarah here. It says in chapter 23, Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died at Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and Abraham went to mourn for Sarah and to weep over her. What seems strange about that? What's that? He wasn't with her. This is the aspect of this is good Jewish practice of wrestling with Scripture that we talked about in week 1 with the story of Jacob wrestling with God. That we are meant to wrestle with Scripture. We are meant to wrestle with God and God's Word. And in good Jewish practice, they look at this verse and say, why is Abraham not with Sarah? It says Sarah dies, and Abraham goes to where she is when she died. So the question is, why is he not with her? And this is what has led many in Jewish tradition to think that Abraham and Sarah got a divorce. That there was no way that their marriage can be reconciled after what Abraham did in going to sacrifice Isaac. It tells us later in chapter 25, Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. Now, the author never gives us the timeline. We don't know if he married Keturah while Sarah was still alive or if he marries her later. We don't know the timeline, But we know Abraham took another wife, and we know that he has to travel to where Sarah is when she dies. So we don't know what the, their relationship there really was. And you can imagine, I mean, what would you think if you were Sarah? I skipped to that verse 9. I need to go back. So yeah, if you're said, this is why I mentioned earlier, some people think that Abraham just sent Isaac back to Sarah. You go live with your mother. I'm going to live in Beersheba. And honestly, from this point in the story, Abraham and Isaac don't ever interact anymore. Our very first slide tonight was a picture of Isaac and Rebekah holding their twin sons, Jacob and Esau, and Abraham is there with them, very grandfatherly smile on his face holding them. But honestly, that artist took a lot of liberties, because from the author of Genesis' point of view, they don't interact anymore. There seems to be no more relationship between Abraham and Isaac. When Abraham speaks the promise that's going to go through Isaac, he speaks it to his servant, who he's sending to go find a wife for his son. He doesn't actually interact with Isaac directly, saying, you need to go find a wife. This is the promise that God has given us. He says to his servant, you need to go find Isaac a wife, because this is the promise that has been given to him. But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, I wonder, like, in your mind, in the story of Abraham and Isaac, what options did Abraham have? Anyone got any feedback? What options did he have? Certainly the option to go through with it, like the story reads out. What other option did Abraham have? To leave what?
Perhaps after the binding, he went and lived his life all by himself. But he could have done that and just skipped the binding. He could have been like, yeah, I'm out. Do your promise with Isaac.
Yeah, it's a great, or even like, he could have said, yeah, just, I'm out of here. Like, do the promise with Isaac. But he could have also just said, no way I'm doing that. I'm out of here. Now, the promise from God to Abraham about the promised land, Abraham could have forfeited it. He could have said, I give it up. Take this land back. I'm going back to my homeland, going back to that family. I'm not going to kill my son. I'm not going to incinerate Isaac like you're asking me to do. He could have done that. There was nothing that said in the covenantal promises that said that Abraham could not have elected to do that. What other options? If you were Abraham as a parent being asked of this, what options would you consider? What options did Abraham have? Say no. That's right. Like, just say no. I'm not going to do it. I don't know what that means for us, the covenant and promises, but I'm not going to do it.
Not really good.
I would have tried to talk him out of it. I would have wrestled with God and said, are you sure that that's what you mean? I mean, is that really what you wanted?
Yeah, just wrestle, negotiate like he did with Sodom and Gomorrah. Another option would be he could have killed himself. He could have said, you want a sacrifice? Here it is. And just slit his own throat and said, I'm not sacrificing Isaac. The promise is through Isaac. And he's here, he's born, it can continue through him. So here's your sacrifice, God. Abraham had options, and we certainly see the option that he chose. And I mentioned it last week that we don't know what the response would have been from God if he had chosen differently. What if he had said to God, you're not this kind of God, I'm not going to do it? Would God still have declared him to have passed the test? Or was the test only that he would actually go through with killing his son? Now, certainly, we hold Abraham up in high esteem. If you read the book of Hebrews, it commemorates Abraham for his faith and what he did. Weirdly, in the rest of Hebrew scripture in the Old Testament, this story really doesn't ever come up again. It's central to Jewish faith and practice to this day, but there doesn't seem to be anything we're supposed to really learn from it, like from the rest of the perspective of the author of Genesis and the authors of the Old Testament. It doesn't really come up a whole lot. It's just kind of there, this story that takes place. I want to mention here, this is what's called the Tomb of the Patriarchs. It's in the modern Israeli city called Hebron. Buried here are Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. Rachel is buried near Bethlehem, but this is the Tomb of the Patriarchs. It's actually a Muslim holy site. Because of their association, obviously, with Abraham, they commemorate the same people here, and they have this split sharing. Like Muslims and Jews, they have certain days of the year where they could go on the other people's side. Like they kind of have it split up, like where you can go on any day of the year, but like 10 days of the year, the Jews are allowed to go on the Muslim side, and 10 days a year, the Muslims are allowed to go on the Jewish side of the Tomb of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs here. So I mentioned that Abraham sends his servant to get Isaac a wife. He sends him up to a place called Padam-aram. He says, go get him a wife from, our family. It's our people. We don't want him marrying any of these other people, essentially like Ishmael did. So he says, go up there to my brother and get somebody a wife for Isaac. Essentially tell him, go get one of Isaac's cousins to be his wife, and that's who Rebekah is. And the servant goes, and it's one of our first pictures of Isaac as this person he's very inactive in a lot of our story. Rebekah's the one that's always moving. So from the very start, he's just sitting back at home in the tents, waiting for a servant to go get a wife for him and bring him back. And this isn't like a couple-day journey to go do this. It's a long journey to where the servant is going to bring a wife back to him. But from the start, the servant goes to find Rebekah, finds her at this well, and from the very start, she's running, she's going quickly. There's a whole bunch of movement from Rebekah, and that's going to come across for the author of Genesis. That's setting up the entire story of Isaac and Rebekah's relationship. That Isaac is very passive, and Rebekah's the one who acts in their story and their interaction. So when they finally meet, it's again Rebekah who looks on ahead and sees Isaac and asks the servant, who is that? And he says, well, that's Isaac, the one you're here for. And she gets down and goes to Isaac. So again, that movement and action there from Rebekah, not from Isaac. This real quickly is just the death of Abraham. It says Abraham lived 175 years, then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age. An old man and full of years, he was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in the field of Ephron. That's that place I showed you, and those place names there are the modern city of Hebron. So Ishmael and Isaac come together to bury their father. I mentioned last week I was going to show you this map. This is a map of like this quote-unquote Arab world that really is most of the people that trace their lineage to Ishmael are in mostly these countries. So Jacob and Esau, this is in oh wait, what chapter is this? Chapter 25, verse 19. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. So a continuation of our childless theme here and miraculous pregnancies. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. The Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So notice here, this part of the promise is given to Rebekah, not to Isaac. Remember that Abraham speaks the promise to his servant about Isaac, but not to Isaac. And so here, Rebekah goes to ask God, why is this happening to me? Why does my pregnancy feel weird? And he tells her that, there's two babies in there. They're jostling with each other. The older will serve the younger. So essentially, God is telling Rebekah the promise is going to go to the younger son. And we don't know if Rebekah ever tells Isaac this, which is going to matter for the story that's coming up. We don't know if she shares this information or if she keeps it to herself. But it's interesting that for the author's perspective, that this part of the promise is spoken to Rebekah, not to Isaac. And it gives her some sort of responsibility in making sure it comes about. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red. His whole body was like a hairy garment, so they called him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Now, that name Jacob is going to come up over and over again in his life, because what it says here is that Jacob's the younger brother. He comes out after Esau, but grasping at his heel. Now, in Hebrew, that phrase is the same as saying like somebody who's deceptive, somebody who's a trickster. He's grasping at the heel. Is like a euphemism or phrase that basically means like deceiver. So his very name Jacob. Remember later on when Jacob wrestles with God, that the angel says, you're no longer going to be called Jacob. You're no longer going to be called deceiver, but Israel, wrestling with God, the God fighter. But for most of his life, he's known as Jacob, the one who grasps at others' heels, the one who is deceptive, the one who is a trickster. And so from his very birth, his life is kind of set up that way. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So notice that right away. It says Isaac loves Esau, the oldest son, the firstborn son, which makes sense in that culture, but it says Rebekah loved Jacob. We don't know why she favored Jacob, other than we know that God told her the older will serve the younger. In other words, the promise is going to go through Jacob. So it's saying she loved Jacob more. It might just mean she favored him because she understands that's where the promise is supposed to go through. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew." Now here's another picture that's kind of showing them. Jacob's the kind of person who lives among the tents, and Esau on the right there is the skillful hunter who goes out and about. Here's just kind of a cartoonish, brutish way of showing that. Esau with his red hairiness there, and little Jacob there with his red stew. Now in the NIV, they translate it as, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." But in the Hebrew, it just says stuff. It's like Esau can't even think of the word for stew. Like, give me some of that red stuff you got over there. Like, I don't know what that is, but give me some of that red stuff. And it again kind of portrays him as this more brutish, character. Now contrast that with Jacob, where he says, Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." So automatically Jacob launches into like legal mode. Like, he's got a plan, he's got it thought out here of what's going to happen. Esau's like, "Give me some red stuff." He's like, "We're going to sign a contract right here now." Like, so automatically we start to see Jacob as this person who is deceptive and kind of a trickster here. So Esau says, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" Now he says he's famished. He's not like, we say I'm starving to death or something like that when we're just hungry. He's probably not meaning like I'm literally about to die right here. The portrait from the author of Genesis is Esau's not the kind of person who thinks about the future. The phrase in Hebrew is more like, "Well, I'm going to die someday." Like, what good is this birthright, this inheritance? The birthright is just his rights as the firstborn son, which essentially means more inheritance. So that's what Jacob is asking from him. Give me your double portion. You're the oldest son. You're supposed to get a double portion of the inheritance. Sell me that double portion of the inheritance. And Esau's like, I'm going to die one way or the other, and I'm hungry right now. Esau thinks about now, and Jacob thinks about long term, and he's planning for the long term. Esau's saying, what good is that going to be to me in the future? I'm hungry right now. And Jacob's thinking is, I need that birthright for my future. I need that birthright for my children. So that's already what the author is setting up here, the differences between Esau and Jacob. But Jacob said, swear to me first. So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Verse 34, then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentils too. He gave him the red stuff. He ate and drank, and then he got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. Well, not surprising. He was kind of mad after the fact, basically. Like, I shouldn't have done that, but I needed the red stuff now. So now it skips ahead a little bit. Verse 34, when Esau was 40 years old, he married Judith, daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and also this other Hittite woman. They were a source of grief to Isaac and Rebekah. Now, chapter 27, when Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau, his older brother, and said to him, my son, here I am, Esau replied. Isaac said, I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. Now, I forgot this, but here's another cartoonish picture. Now, we have this picture is certainly of Isaac, like, on his quote-unquote deathbed. And that's the picture that's given here. It's usually the picture that we have. But Isaac doesn't actually die for at least 20 more years. But his entire life, Isaac is portrayed by the author of Genesis as almost slowly dying. His entire life, he's kind of more weak. His two biggest moments of his entire life in the story of Genesis, he's laying down. He's laying down on the altar. Abraham's about to sacrifice him. And here he's laying down to give this blessing to one of his sons. So certainly for the author of Genesis, that's kind of the picture of Isaac. And remember from the very beginning, the author is portraying Isaac as somebody who's kind of passive, inactive. Rebekah's the one who takes charge, takes action in their story with them. So Isaac calls Esau to him. Remember that he favors Esau. And we don't know if Rebekah ever told him, God told me that Jacob's the one that's supposed to get the blessing and the promise. So we don't know if this is Isaac saying, I know better, or I'm not going to go against custom, I'm going to give it to Esau, or if this is him just going with the plan because he doesn't know that from Rebekah. We don't know. The author never tells us. But he says to Esau, I'm an old man, I don't know the day of my death. We'd like, it's 20 years from now, but okay, you feel like you're dying. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my blessing before I die. Now Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau. When Esau left for the open country to hunt game and bring it back, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, look, I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, give me some game and prepare me some tasty food to eat so that you may give my blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die. Now, my son, Jacob, listen carefully and do what I tell you. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats so I can prepare some tasty food for your father just the way he likes it. Then take it to your father to eat so that he may give you his blessing before he dies. Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, but my brother Esau is a hairy man while I have smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing. But Rebekah, his mother, said to him, my son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me. So already it's a weird scenario. Like Isaac is saying to Esau, go out and hunt me something good and bring it back for me. And Rebekah hears this and knows this isn't how God said it was supposed to be. This isn't how God said the blessing is supposed to go to Jacob. So automatically Rebekah sets in motion this plan to make sure that Jacob gets that blessing, because her understanding from God is that's what is supposed to happen. Jacob's supposed to get the blessing. So if Isaac's not going to do it, she's going to be the one to make sure that it happens. So all this scenario, like Jacob's like, well, Esau's hairy, I'm not. What if he touches me? He's going to know. Then he's going to think I'm tricking him. That word is put there by the author just to remind us that Jacob's name means trickery or trickster. He's going to think that I'm living up to my name, and tricking him. Then he's going to curse me rather than bless me. And Rebekah says, it's on me. Just do what I say and go make these preparations. So he went and got them and brought them to his mother, and she prepared some tasty food just the way the father liked it. Then Rebekah took the best clothes of Esau, her older son, which she had in the house, and put them on her younger son Jacob. She also covered his hands and smoothed part of his neck with the goat skins. Verse 17, then she handed to her son Jacob the tasty food and the bread she had made. When he went to his father, he said, my father. Yes, my son, he answered. Who is it? Jacob said to his father, I'm Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing. Isaac asked his son, how did you find it so quickly? The Lord your God gave me success, he replied. Then Isaac said to Jacob, come near so I can touch you, to know whether you are really my son Esau or not. So Isaac knows something's up. He, for all that Jacob can fake about putting hair on his arms or whatever it is, the clothes of Esau so he smells like he's a hunter and not a guy who just lives among the tents, for all that, he can't seemingly disguise his voice enough. So Isaac automatically, well, who is that? Remember, it tells us Isaac's like, he's old and he's blind. He's like, this feeble picture again of Isaac. He's old, his eyes aren't good, he's blind, he can't see, so he's like, well, who is that? Oh, I'm Esau. You don't sound like Esau. Come closer so I can feel your skin to make sure you're really Esau. Jacob went close to his father Isaac, this is verse 22, who touched him and said, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him, for his hands were hairy like those of his brother Esau. So he proceeded to bless him. Are you really my son Esau? He asked. I am, he replied. Then he said, my son, bring me some of your game to eat so that I may give you my blessing. Jacob brought it to him and he ate, and he brought some wine and the drink. Then his father Isaac said to him, come here, my son, and kiss me. So he went to him and kissed him. Then Isaac caught the smell of his clothes. He blessed him and said, ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness and abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed. After Isaac finished blessing him, and Jacob had scarcely left his presence, his brother Esau came in from hunting. He too prepared some tasty food and brought it to his father. Then he said to him, my father, please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may give me your blessing. Well, who are you? I'm your son, your firstborn Esau. Isaac trembled violently and said, who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me? I ate it just before you came, and I blessed him, and indeed he will be blessed. When Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry and said to his father, bless me too, my father. But he said, your brother came deceitfully, like a Jacob, and took your blessing. Esau said, isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing. So it's funny, like Esau saying, isn't he rightly named Jacob? Isn't he rightly named grasping at the heel? Isn't he rightly named deceiver? It's like he fulfilled what his name means. That's the kind of person that he is. And for this culture, naming was significant not just at birth, but because of the naming process at birth, what you were named kind of set you, it was believed then, it set you up for who you were going to become. It's almost like you lived up to what your name was. And the picture here is certainly that Jacob does that. But my name, Matthew, means gift from God. And I think we can all agree that I've lived up to my name there. But my mom, like she has, like a lot of parents, has nicknames for, her kids, my brother, sister, and I. My sister and my brother are not surprising. My brother, Scott, he was Scotter Water Doodah, and just kind of became Water, whatever, like this. That just kind of became his nickname. Carrie, of course, or Carissa, she was Carrie Berry, and I was Bieber. I don't know, nobody knows. My mom still doesn't even know where that came from, Bieber. Now, beber in Spanish means to drink. So my mom thinks I lived up to my name because as a kid, I was always thirsty. In fact, when I was really little in this church in Sunday school, that we were learning of the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, with the loaves and the fishes. And I asked the teacher, very concerned, but what did they drink? So I was very concerned about that. And certainly I seem to have lived up to that name. And Esau here is saying he's lived up to his name. How right it is that he's named Jacob, because he's just a trickster. He's a deceiver. Then he asked, haven't you reserved any blessing for me? Isaac answered Esau, I have made him lord over you, and have made all his relatives his servants, and I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So what can I possibly do for you, my son? Esau said to his father, do you have only one blessing? Bless me too. So his father Isaac said, your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness. That's not a good start. Away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck. Do you ever get a fortune cookie? These are the kinds of ones you want. So fortune cookies now seem like they're just lotto numbers and other weird stuff. Like, they're not that good anymore. But like this one, your troubles will soon cease and good fortune will smile upon you. It's like, okay, that's good. That's the kind of one you want. And that's like what, Isaac essentially gave to Jacob. And Esau says, give me one too. And then Jacob gets, the fortune you seek is in another cookie. It's like, oh, those aren't the good ones. And he's like, this isn't the good one. I didn't get the good blessing here from my father. So Esau held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, the days of mourning for my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob. Verse 42, when Rebekah was told that her older son Esau had said, she sent for her younger son Jacob and said to him, your brother Esau is planning to avenge himself by killing you. Now then, my son, do what I say. Flee at once to my brother Laban in Haran. Stay with him for a while until your brother's fury subsides. When your brother is no longer angry with you and forgets what you did to him, I'll send for word for you to come back from there. Why should I lose both of you in one day? Now notice this picture for the author of Genesis, that remember there's this constant separation that's happening. So right away we have separation between these two brothers. For most of the stories of their entire life, there's this separation between them. And Jacob is supposed to be the fulfillment of the promise that was given to Abraham, that was given to Isaac, and is given to him, that all nations will be blessed through you. And that there's this kind of reunification, a reconciliation that's going to happen because of you. But what happens here? He's scattered. This instance that happened, remember that when we talked about the Tower of Babel, that all the people of the world were together at that point and speaking the same language. Then what happens? They're all scattered away. But the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is supposed to reverse that and bring the world back together. But in this story, it's Jacob who is now being scattered. So automatically, again, we know the author is setting up, he's got the problem, we're looking for the reconciliation. We're looking for God to fix the problem that is happening here. Now, one weird aspect of this story, I think, is why didn't Isaac just reverse the blessing? Once it was clear that Jacob had tricked him and deceived him, why didn't he just say, well, you don't get the blessing anymore? You can't get the blessing by deceit. So there's some aspect that people think, well, you can't actually reverse a blessing once it's given. It's given. If you look like in the book of Esther, when the king makes a pronouncement, he can't reverse that pronouncement, has to give another pronouncement to kind of fix that pronouncement, but he can't just reverse it. But that's not really what's going on here with Isaac and his two sons. What Isaac sees in Jacob, he probably sees a lot of himself in Jacob. It's kind of funny. I have, some of my cousins. I had one cousin in particular that just always seemed to butt heads with our grandma. Like they would just always kind of at each other. They just always butt his head kind of her whole life. It's not that they didn't love each other or enjoy each other at certain times. They just kind of always butted heads. And the rest of the family was kind of funny because we could see from the outside in, they were exactly alike. Like my cousin was exactly like my grandma. And it was like, that's what they just kind of butted heads for that reason almost. For Isaac, you wonder if he sees that same thing in Jacob that he sees in himself. You know, his son Jacob's somebody who kind of lives among the tents. You know, Isaac certainly seems to be somebody who is not very active. He's very passive. He kind of stays among the tents. So you wonder if Isaac's worried about Jacob. I'm worried that Jacob's going to end up being like me. And that's not a good way to get through this world. What he sees in Jacob is somebody who can plan ahead. He looks to the future. You know, we say he lives among the tents, but he's not just like some trust fund baby or something that just sits and does nothing like in the tents. It's somebody who would have been like kind of agriculture asset, somebody who certainly Jacob would be somebody who like can cultivate the land. To cultivate the land you have to plan ahead. You have to, prepare the soil, you have to plant the seed, you have to tend it, you have to go out. Esau's the opposite. He goes day to day. He goes out and he kills something, he cooks it and eats it. Hey, look at that red stuff. I want some. Give it to me. You need my birthright? I'll be dead someday. I'll just give me what I want now. Whereas Jacob plans for the future, but what Isaac also sees in Jacob is somebody who's a little bit of a weakling. Somebody who's the world is going to eat him alive. You know, there's on the show Cheers, if any of you watched that, like in the 80s and 90s, there was this recurring theme of this character Norm coming into the bar, and they say, "What's up, Norm?" and he gives some smart aleck response. And in one of those, they say, "How's it going, Norm?" and he says, "It's a dog-eat-dog world, and I'm wearing milk-bone underwear." You know, that's his response. And for Jacob, it's like, it's a dog-eat-dog world, and he wears milk-bone underwear. From Isaac's perspective, that Jacob's not the kind of guy who's going to do well in this world. He's got to fight for himself. He's got to be somebody who's not just living among the tents and thinking about the future. Now, Esau's the opposite again. He thinks for the then and now. You know, Jacob seems to be somebody who's respectful of Isaac and Rebekah. Esau, in other portrayals here in our story that we didn't read, is somebody who doesn't just outright disrespect Isaac and Rebekah, but he's not like Jacob. So here's the scenario that's set up. For Isaac, he's going to give the blessing to Esau, but what he wants to see from Esau is that Esau will he can prepare. He's not just going to go out and kill something and eat it. He's going to go out, he's going to kill something, but he's going to prepare. He has to prepare the meal. Now, he could have just had Rebekah make the meal like she probably always did, but he asked Esau to do it because he wants Esau to go out and prove that he can be this kind of person. From Isaac's perspective, he's like, I'm not worried about Esau in this world. It's a dog-eat-dog world, and Esau will kill everybody. Esau can fend for himself in this world. He's strong enough. What I want to see from him is he's the kind of person who can think for the future, that he can go out and plan this meal and bring it back to me out of respect. He wants to see that from Esau. And if he sees it from Esau, he's going to go through and give him the blessing. Now, when Jacob comes to him and Isaac knows something is up, he's like, you don't sound like Esau. Let me feel your arms. Well, they're hairy like Esau. Let me smell your clothes. Well, they smell like Esau. And we normally think that Isaac is totally fooled in this. Now, he's kind of partially fooled. But in the end, for Isaac, it doesn't really matter which son this is. It's either Esau, who can fend for himself in this world, but has now proven that he can think ahead and plan for the future and be the kind of person worthy of the blessing, or this is Jacob, who he never worries about as far as respect for parents, respect for other people, planning for the future, but has finally proven that he's willing to dig his heels in and fight for something and to survive in this world. It's a tough world, and Jacob has now proved he's willing to do it. So for Isaac, it's almost like, it doesn't matter which son this is. That's the son that gets the blessing because they prove they can be both sides. They can plan for the future and fight fight for themselves in this world. So he gives the blessing to Jacob. Now, that's partly why, he doesn't take it back. Why would he take it back? When Esau comes in, he says, well, who was that? And he's like, isn't it right that he's named Jacob? He deceived all of us. He's tricked me twice. He tricked you now. And it's almost like you can see Isaac go, well, good for him. Finally he's standing up for himself. Finally he's fighting in this world. Finally he's showing some strength in this world and not just sitting among the tents. Now, why did that happen? Did it happen because Jacob was that kind of person? No, it happened because of Rebekah. Rebekah's the one that took charge and said, God said that Jacob is the one that's supposed to get the blessing. And she's the one that takes the action. Just like the author has shown us her whole life. From the very start, when the servant goes to get her as a wife for Isaac, she's the one in action. She's the one moving. She's the one that is not just passive, but acting in the story. And again, just like Lot's daughters, the author of Genesis makes no judgment about her deception. If anything, once again, from the author of Genesis' perspective, it's a good thing that she did, not bad. Down through the years, especially in Christian circles, Rebekah has always been portrayed as kind of this manipulative scam artist, basically, and is looked down on it, that what she did here was a sin. Now, certainly, I think we kind of read back into that. From the author of Genesis' perspective, that's not the case at all. There's no judgment about what she did. Like I said, if anything, not only does she not condemn it, but he says this is what needed to happen. It's Rebekah who makes sure that the promises of God are fulfilled through Jacob like they're supposed to be, not Isaac. So we're always talking about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promises that are given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The covenant that is made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the true connection between Abraham and Jacob is not Isaac. It's really Rebekah from the author's perspective. She's the one that makes sure that connection happens there but between the two of them. Are there any questions or comments on any of that? Yeah, Winnie?
But decided to act and not wait on God to see what was going to happen. So Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham because she couldn't wait or take the chance that something wouldn't work out. And then Rebekah told, Jacob to deceive his father because, again, the point I'm making is, where's the trust in God? If God is powerful enough to give a promise, don't they trust that he can carry it out? That God needs them, is what I'm trying to say. And as we relate it to us, sometimes we want to help God. We know something, we want to trust God, but still we think that maybe God needs a little bit of help. So I'm just kind of wondering where was the trust in God and seeing God as
I think that's a fair assessment of back then. Remember that when Sarah gives Hagar to Abraham to have a son with, that she had not been told at that point that she was the one that would give birth to this future of promise that has been given to Abraham. So it's not till later that she's told, you're the one that's going to give birth to that son of promise. So you're right. She acts in a way of saying, I know the promise that has been given to my husband Abraham. I need to do something to make that happen. And she gives Hagar to Abraham to have that son. In a similar way, you're right. In a similar way, Rebekah here is saying, I need to make sure the promises of God are fulfilled and continued with the right person. Because it looked like from the outset they were going to go to the wrong person. This blessing that Isaac said, Esau, go out and do this and bring it back to me so I can bless you. That she is saying that Rebekah takes it on herself to make sure that it goes to the right person, just like Sarah seems to take it on herself. Now, your question about where's the trust, I don't think that the author of Genesis would see it as distrustful that they are doing these things. Remember, they're coming from the point of view of circumcision is an act of participating in creation. That's what they thought. Like we talked about last week. If God meant for male humans to be circumcised, why were they not just created that way and born that way? Why the act of circumcision? And from their perspective, it's the humans are taking part in the act of creation there. And so I think there's an aspect of human interaction with God to bring these about. You didn't think of the story later with Moses, having to have his arms raised for the battle to be won. Like, there was no need for that except for the interaction of Moses and those holding his arms up with what God is doing on the battlefield for them. So I think for the author of Genesis, who would also be the author in Exodus, like, there's that aspect of humans taking part in the promises of God, trying to be active in them.
But we don't know if God asked them for the help.
No, we certainly don't know if God asked them for the help, except in the case of Rebekah, maybe, where certainly God doesn't tell Lot's daughters to do what they did. God doesn't tell Sarah to give Hagar to Abraham. The only difference with Rebekah is God does tell Rebekah that Jacob's supposed to be the one to receive the promise. But he certainly doesn't say, now later on, you're going to have to use deception and trickery to do that, just like Lot's daughters used deception and trickery to do what they did. But again, the author of Genesis doesn't make any judgments as far as sin or, wrong moral choices for them. Again, it's kind of, he just lays out. Remember that Genesis doesn't give us any of that. Genesis, there's not doctrine, there's not theology, there's not always this is good and this is bad. The author of Genesis is like, here's this family, they're pretty messed up, but God uses it, God's going to use them. God's going to turn these nobodies into somebodies to bless the whole world. So there's that aspect, I think. Yeah, Bob?
Other than just the theme of separation, aren't there other obvious parallels between Cain and Abel, those brothers, and these brothers, Esau and Jacob?
Yeah, we're certainly going to see throughout Genesis especially that the idea of the younger brother receiving the promise, being the one who's blessed. So there's going to be a kind of a continuing theme of younger brother versus older brother. Oh, yeah. Oh, certainly, yeah. What Bob's saying between Cain and Abel and Jacob and Esau, the idea of like one is, a hunter, one is cultivating land and agriculture. Yeah, certainly I see what you're saying there. But yeah, and just as there was separation between Cain and Abel, there's separation certainly between Jacob and Esau. I mean, right away, Esau's like, I'm going to kill this guy. And Rebekah knows it and says, you got to get out of here, Jacob. Go back up. When she says go up to Padan Aram, that's where she's from. Remember, Abraham sends a servant to Padan Aram to his brother to get his niece Rebekah to come marry his son Isaac. Hopefully you followed that a little bit. But so now she's sending him back up to Padan Aram, basically saying, you got to flee. You got to go there for a while. Get yourself a wife while you're up there. Go back to my father and get basically a cousin of yours to marry while you're up there. So yeah, again, we see the author setting up this aspect of separation between humans and from each other and humans from God. Any other question or comment on Zoom or here?
There was. Let's see. Is it possible Rebekah had told Jacob about what God had told her, and he was just waiting for his chance to move forward on the plan? And also, why did Jacob ask for Esau's birthright if Isaac's blessing would count instead?
Well, I think the birthright part of that kind of is just setting up who Jacob is. And for the author of Genesis, he's also setting up the idea of separation from early on in their relationship. really beginning with inside Rebekah's womb. Like they're jostling in her womb. There's obviously something going on there to the point that she's like, this is weird. I don't know what's happening here. She's probably consulting with other women. Like, is this normal? And they're like, that's not normal. She's like, I got to go ask God about this. And God says, there's two nations in your womb wrestling with you, jostling with each other. They're kind of at war already with each other. And, the older will serve the younger. So from the very beginning, there's a setup by the author of Genesis of this separation between the two of them and this kind of animosity between the two. So the birthright story, I think, is a continuation of that aspect of the story before they even get to the blessing part. The birthright thing is really just a legal aspect. Remember, it's like Esau comes in and he's like, I want that red stuff. And Jacob's like, I have this contract drawn up, for you. He's very purposeful, thinking about the future. He's like, I want you to sign this if I'm going to give you the red stuff. So that's very much just kind of a legal process that doesn't have anything to do with the blessing specifically aspect of the story. What was the first part of that question? I kind of answered the second part. How did that question start?
Is it possible Rebekah told Jacob about what
that's right.
God had told her?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned that. Like, we don't know. The author of Genesis doesn't tell us if Rebekah told Isaac or not what God had told her. You kind of would assume that she would have. Like, hey, this is. If he asked, hey, what's up with your, what's up with your pregnancy? You were feeling weird earlier. She's like, oh yeah, I asked God about it. This is what he told me. Like, you'd almost expect that as part of their marriage, but we're never told that she says it specifically. So once it gets to Isaac on his quote-unquote deathbed 20 years before he dies, that like he's just saying, he's setting up this situation to give the promise and blessing to Esau. We don't know. Does he know that does he think Esau's not gonna do it? And so he's gonna give it to Jacob? We don't know. It seems that Esau does go through with it. He comes back ready for the blessing. He did what his father said. It's just so happened that Jacob had done it first, had proved himself first. So, yeah, we don't know if Rebekah told Isaac and what Isaac was thinking when he set this up. From the story, just at face value perspective, it just seems like it already told us, hey, Isaac favors Esau, Rebekah favors Jacob. So when it comes time to give the blessing, because he thinks he's going to die, he's going to give it to Esau as the firstborn son. Any other question or comment? Well, we'll start next week with our last week together. We'll start by looking at Jacob going up to Paddan-aram and meeting Rachel, meeting Leah. He, of course, has 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. One of those sons is Joseph. And you may or may not be familiar with Joseph's story, but we'll talk about Jacob meeting Rachel and Leah and marrying them next week, and then also about the story of Joseph and how the story of Judah and Tamar fits in as well, not just to the Joseph story, but to the whole story in the book of Genesis. And we'll close with that next week, seeing how the author of Genesis is showing us of God's actions to fix the separation that happens between humans with each other and humans with God. So hope to see you next week in our last week together. Thanks.